The fissure was not wide enough for a man, which is why it had saved them. It was a vertical wound in the rock face, a dark line in a sea of sun-bleached granite, no wider than her own shoulders. From a distance, it was invisible. Up close, it was an impossibility. Her grandfather's letter had called it the needle's eye. He had written that the world would have to be broken before she would seek it, and the world had broken. It had cracked down the middle when her husband's heart stopped, and it had crumbled to dust when the banker took the house and the town looked away, their faces smooth and hard as river stones. All that was left was what they could carry, a dog whose loyalty felt like a final human kindness, and a folded paper with a map drawn from a dead man's memory. The journey had stripped them down to bone and will. 3 days they walked away from the last dirt track, into a landscape that grew only rock and heat. The widow, just 25 but feeling ancient, wore a light pink prairie dress that was now grey with dust, its hem frayed to threads. A once white apron, stained with the journey's grime, was tied at her waist. She carried the heaviest pack, the weight of familiar ache in her shoulders. Her mother, 70 years of age, followed her step for step, a grey scarf covering her hair, her light brown dress the colour of the earth itself. Her face was a fine net of wrinkles, but her eyes were clear, missing nothing. And the boy, her son, walked between them, his small hand often finding his grandmother's. He did not complain. He watched everything, his gaze serious. The dog, a shepherd with a coat the colour of sable and smoke, ranged ahead, a silent scout, his paws sure on the hot stone. When they finally found the twin pillars of rock described in the letter, doubt settled in the widow's stomach like a cold stone. The wall before them was seamless, a monument to indifference. There was no door. There was no hope. The dog whined, sniffing at the base of the cliff. The boy, tired and thirsty, sat down without a word. Her mother touched her arm. Her hand was dry, but the touch was steady. It was the dog who found it, nudging his nose into a thicket of brittle, thorny brush that clung to a dark line in the rock. The fissure. It was exactly as the letter had described, too narrow for a threat, just wide enough for a prayer. The widow pushed aside the branches, her hand scratched and bleeding. The air that breathed out was cool and smelled of deep earth and stone. It was the smell of a tomb or a genesis. She looked back at her mother, at her son. Their faces were masks of exhaustion. There was no other choice. She took off her pack, pushed it into the opening, and squeezed her body in after it. The rock was cold and tight against her ribs, scraping her skin. For a moment, there was only darkness and the sound of her own breathing. Then she was through. She stood in a space that should not exist. It was not a cave. It was a room, vast and vaulted, the ceiling lost in shadow. A high, unseen opening cast down a soft, milky luminescence that pooled on the stone floor. The air was still and cool, the silence profound. After the relentless glare of the sun, it was like stepping into a deep pool of water. She turned and helped her mother through the fissure, then the boy. The dog wriggled through last, shook his coat once, and stayed close to her leg, his body tense. They stood together, small figures in a cathedral of stone. Her mother's hand went to her throat, her eyes wide. The boy made no sound at all, simply tilting his head back, trying to see the top of the dark. Following the last instruction in the letter, the widow walked toward the far wall. There, carved directly from the living rock, was a home. It was all one piece, a low, wide hearth, its chimney a dark passage climbing into the stone, 2 raised platforms for sleeping, smoothed by patient hands, and a long table with a bench, all of it part of the same monolithic structure. On the table were neatly stacked blankets, a tinderbox, and a small, leather-bound book. In recessed shelves cut into the wall were tools, their handles worn smooth with use, a hammer, chisels, an adze, a saw. There were sealed clay jars and canvas sacks. She opened one. Dried beans. Another held flour. Another, salt. It was a legacy of labor, a testament of love left by a man who had foreseen their ruin and spent years carving a sanctuary against it. He had built them an ark of stone. The widow ran her hand along the edge of the sleeping platform. It was cool and solid. She felt the pressure in her chest, the knot of fear she had carried for weeks, begin to loosen. They were hidden. They were safe from the world. But a new fear, sharp and immediate, replaced it. She unscrewed the cap from her canteen and looked inside. Only a few drops remained. She checked her mother's, the boys'. The same. The jars held food, but there was no barrel for water, no sign of a well. The air was cool but dry. The silence was broken only by their breathing. The dog paced, sniffing the floor, then let out a low whine. The stone room, the boy whispered, his voice small in the immense quiet. He had named it. The widow looked at the sealed jars, the waiting blankets, the silent, empty hearth. She had led them out of the furnace and into a beautiful, perfect tomb. They had found a home, and they would die of thirst in it. The search began with a quiet, desperate methodicalness. The widow took one side of the great chamber, her mother the other. The boy, understanding the gravity of their task without being told, walked the center, his eyes scanning the floor. The dog trotted ahead of the widow, his nose to the ground, working in tight, searching patterns. The chamber was a long, irregular oval, perhaps 200 paces from end to end. The walls were a tapestry of grey and dun rock, mostly dry, but with dark patches of ancient mineral stain. The widow examined these first, running her hands over them. They were cold but not damp. She looked for moss, for any sign of life that depended on moisture, but found only pale, dormant lichen. The ground was a mix of fine, sandy dust and smooth, worn stone. There was no channel, no depression, no sign that water had ever flowed here. Her grandfather had been a practical man. He would not have built this place, this elaborate refuge, without providing for the most essential need. The thought was a small, hard kernel of faith in her chest. The logic had to be there. She just had to learn to see it. She completed her circuit of the wall and met her mother near the entrance fissure. The old woman had not been walking. She stood perfectly still in a corner of the chamber, her head tilted slightly, her eyes closed. She was a study in stillness, a small, upright form against the immense curve of the rock. The widow stopped, waiting. Her own panic felt loud and clumsy next to her mother's quiet concentration. She wanted to hammer on the walls, to scream into the unfeeling stone. "It's here," her mother said, her voice soft but certain. She did not open her eyes. "Can you not hear it?" The widow listened. She heard the faint echo of her own pulse in her ears, the whisper of the boy's feet shuffling in the dust. Nothing else. Hear what? The stone. It sings a different song here. She opened her eyes and pointed to a section of the wall a few feet away. It looked no different from the rest. The widow pressed her ear against the rock. It was cold, solid. She was about to pull away when she felt it, more than heard it, a deep, low vibration, a hum so subtle it was almost imagined. And with it, a sound. The thinnest thread of a sound, like a single strand of silk being pulled through the rock. It was water. Hidden. She found the source with her fingertips, a hairline crack, sealed with calcite deposits, running vertically down the wall. From the tool shelves, she brought back a heavy hammer and a fine-tipped chisel. She set the point of the chisel against the crack. "Careful," her mother cautioned. "Don't kill it." The widow took a breath and tapped the hammer. A small chip of rock flew off. She tapped again, a steady, rhythmic beat. Metal on stone, the sound sharp and clear in the vast silence. The boy came and sat nearby, gathering the fragments of rock into a small pile. The dog lay with its head on its paws, watching her. It was slow, painstaking work. Dust filled her nose and mouth. Her arm began to ache, the muscles in her shoulder burning. She was carving into the mountain itself, chasing a sound. After an hour, a dark line of moisture appeared along the crack. A wetness. She worked faster, her heart hammering with a mixture of hope and fear. With a final, solid strike, a larger piece of rock gave way, and water broke free. It was not a gush, but a steady, clear trickle, emerging from the dark seam and running down the wall. She held her cupped hands under it, the water impossibly cold. It tasted of stone and deep time. They used one of the cooking pots to catch the flow, the sound of the first drop striking the bottom loud as drum beats. Drip. 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 A rhythm of survival. The scene was life. The days found their shape around the water. The first task of the morning was to empty the full pot into a larger clay basin and replace it under the slow, steady trickle from the seam. The sound of it became the heartbeat of the stone room, a constant assurance against the silence. They had water. They could drink freely. They could mix flour for flatbreads baked on a hot stone at the edge of the fire. The immediate, sharp-edged fear receded, replaced by the quiet industry of establishing a life. The water that trickled from the seam did not pool on the floor and evaporate. It found a natural channel in the stone, a slight depression that led it to the lowest point in the chamber. There, it had formed a pool, perhaps 10 feet across, its edges disappearing into blackness. The surface was still as dark mica, reflecting the dim light from above. The widow assumed it was a simple cistern, its depth unknown. It was the boy who discovered its secret. He would spend hours lying on his stomach at the pool's edge, staring into the depths. The adults left him to it. It was a quiet occupation in a place with few distractions. One afternoon, he came to the widow, his face alight with discovery. "There's something alive in there," he said, his voice a hushed, excited whisper. "I saw it move." She was skeptical. The place had been sealed for who knew how long. The water was filtered through solid rock. It was just a shadow, little one. "No," he insisted, his small face set with certainty. It was silver to humor him. She lit a splinter of pitch pine from the stores. The flame wavered, casting dancing shadows. She held it over the water. Her mother came to stand with them, the three of them and the dog peering into the dark water. At first, there was nothing. Then, from the deepest part of the pool, a shape emerged, drawn perhaps by the flicker of light. It was a fish, pale and ghostly, its body long and thin. It had no eyes, only smooth indentations where they should have been. As they watched, another joined it, and another. They swam in slow, deliberate circles, creatures perfectly adapted to a world without light, a world of stone and silence. Life. Here, in the heart of the mountain. It was a promise. A sign that this place was not just a shelter, but a complete world, with its own hidden cycles of existence. Her mother let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since they arrived. The boy, however, was not simply awestruck, he was already working. He ran to a smooth, pale stone he had chosen and made a small, sharp scratch on its surface with a piece of flint. "One," he said. He went back to the pool's edge. A few minutes later, he ran back and made another scratch. 2. 3 he had given himself a job. He was the keeper of the fish count. Each day, he would spend a period of time watching the pool, recording the maximum number of fish he could see at once. He called them the stone swimmers. The widow watched him, his small back bent in concentration, and felt a wave of love so fierce it was painful. His earnest precision was a form of faith. They had a source of food, a miracle swimming in the dark. But it was finite, fragile. The gift of the fish was also the burden of their survival. The existence of the fish changed their calculations. It shifted the focus from immediate survival to long-term stewardship. The beans and flour would not last forever. The fish were a renewable resource, but the population in the small, contained pool was a delicate miracle they could easily destroy. One evening, sitting by the low fire, the smell of wood smoke a comfort in the stone air, the widow looked at her mother. "We could eat them," she said, stating the practical fact. Her mother was mending the boy's shirt, her needle moving with a slow, steady rhythm. She did not look up. "How many?" she asked. The boy counted 5 today. "He has never counted more than 7 and if we take one," her mother said, "there will be 4. The simple math of it hung in the air. The unspoken truth was that they did not know how fast the fish reproduced. They did not know the limits of the system they had stumbled into. To act from hunger would be to act from ignorance, and ignorance was a luxury they could not afford. The widow understood. The rules were not for the fish, they were for them. They were a discipline against the panic of scarcity. One a week, the widow decided. And never the largest we see. We will leave the breeders, her mother nodded, biting off the thread. And we thank it was an agreement, sealed without another word. The second problem was the light. The dim, indirect luminescence from the high fissure was enough to see by, but it was a perpetual twilight that wore on the spirit. It fell in a single column, leaving most of the vast chamber in deep shadow. They lived in a circle of firelight, the great dark pressing in around them. The widow, the practical one, thought of using more firewood, of making torches. But the wood supply, like the food, was finite. Her mother, the perceptive one, offered a different solution. She spent a day just watching the light, observing its subtle shifts as the sun moved across the sky outside. She noticed the angle, the way it struck one high, smooth patch of wall. The light wants to come in, she said that evening. We are not inviting it, the widow didn't understand. It needs a mirror, her mother explained, pointing up into the darkness. There in a crate the widow had overlooked, they found them, several thin sheets of hammered tin, polished to a dull sheen. Her grandfather had left them, perhaps for this very purpose. The task was hers. The wall was steep, the handhold small and precarious. Using a length of rope from their stores, she secured herself as best she could and began to climb into the upper darkness of the cavern, the tin sheets tied to her belt. She could hear the boy's sharp intakes of breath below. The dog paced anxiously. It took her 2 days of dangerous, exacting work. She would climb, test the angle, climb down, and adjust the position of the anchor point she hammered into the rock. Her mother stood below, directing her with hand signals, judging the fall of the light. Finally, she secured the last panel. As she hammered the final pin, the geometry aligned. A bright, clean shaft of reflected sunlight shot down from the tin panel, striking another, lower one, and then fanning out, bathing their entire living area in a warm, golden glow. It was like the sun had risen inside the mountain. She rappelled down into the light, her body aching. The boy was standing in the middle of it, his face turned up, his eyes wide with wonder. He was bathed in the color of honey. "Day gold," he whispered. It was more than light. It was hope, made visible. For weeks, their world was contained within the stone. The only sound from outside was the faint, deep hum of the wind over the high peaks, a sound they felt in their bones more than heard with their ears. Then one afternoon, a new sound came. It was sharp, distinct. The scrape of a boot on rock, then another. Voices. The dog's head shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The widow's hand was on his muzzle in an instant, her other hand pulling the boy close. Her mother froze, her face becoming a still, unreadable mask. They melted back into the shadows at the far end of the chamber, away from the telltale trickle of the water seam. The voices grew louder, rough and scraped with thirst. They were just outside the fissure. "Nothing," one voice said. "Whole damn range is baked dry." "Told you we should have stayed on the lower trail, there's gotta be water somewhere," a second voice answered. "Animals gotta drink," the widow held her breath. The boy was trembling, but he made no sound, his face pressed into her skirt. The dog stood rigid under her hand, a coiled spring of tense muscle. They listened as the men moved along the rock face. The scrape of a hand searching for a hold. A muttered curse. Then, a pause directly outside their hidden entrance. "What's this?" It was the second voice. Hole in the rock, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. The widow's heart hammered against her ribs. She could picture the man peering into the darkness, his eyes adjusting. The fissure was narrow, but a curious man might try to widen it. A desperate man would. "Too narrow," the first voice said, his tone dismissive. "Coyote den, maybe. Come on." Where was tin? A daylight air's cool, though, the second man mused. He was still there. Still considering. The widow tightened her grip on the dog. If he barked, they were discovered. If they were discovered, she refused to complete the thought. She focused on the feel of her son's small body against her leg, the solid presence of her mother beside her. This was what she had to protect. I'm telling you, it's a dry hole. This whole mountain's a liar. Looks promising from a distance, gives you nothing and up close. Let's go. There was the sound of spitting, then the crunch of boots moving away over loose rock. The voices faded, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. They did not move. They waited in the shadows for what felt like an eternity. The column of daygold crept across the stone floor, marking the slow passage of the afternoon. The trickle of the water seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. Not until the light from the high fissure had faded completely to grey twilight did the widow allow herself to move. She crept to the entrance, the dog at her heels. Peering through the narrow slit, she saw nothing but empty rock and deepening dusk. The world outside was as it had been, vast, indifferent, and for now, empty of threats. She returned to her mother and son. No one spoke of what had happened. There was no need. The fragility of their peace had been laid bare. That night, before she slept, the widow gathered stones and thorny branches and worked for an hour, making the concealment over the needle's eye thicker, more natural. It was a small defense, but it was all she had. The turn of the seasons happened without them seeing it. They felt it. The rock, which had been a cool relief from the summer heat, now seemed to leach the warmth from their bodies. The quality of the daygold shifted, becoming thinner, whiter. The air that breathed from the fissure grew colder. Outside, the high country was entering its long, dry autumn. The mountain was holding its breath, waiting for winter. And the water seam, the heart of their world, began to fail. The steady trickle that had filled their pot each morning slowed. It became a hesitant drip. The sound that had been their comfort now became a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. The level of the pool at the base of the rock dropped, exposing a dark ring of damp stone around its edge. The widow found herself waking in the night, listening for the drip, counting the seconds between each drop. The clearest measure of the decline came from the boy. His face, usually open and bright, was pinched with worry. He spent longer at the pool's edge, his small body rigid with concentration. His daily report, once delivered with pride, became a troubled whisper. "Only 3, he would say, holding up 3 fingers. "I only saw 3 today." The stone swimmers were retreating into the deepest, unseen parts of the pool as their world shrank. The widow's first instinct was to attack the problem with force, to take the hammer and chisel to the seam and crack it open wider, to demand more from the mountain. But her mother's earlier warning stayed with her: don't kill it. Panic was a blunt instrument. So she chose to watch instead. For 2 full days, she did nothing but observe the seam. She timed the drips. She felt the rock, noting its temperature. She tasted the water, searching for any change in its mineral content. She cleaned the small basin where the water emerged, clearing away the fine silt that had accumulated. The problem, she slowly realized, was not the source. The deep vibration in the rock was still there, as strong as ever. The water was still in the mountain. The problem was the passage. Over the months, the minerals in the water itself had begun to seal the fissure, laying down a fine, hard layer of calcite. The mountain was healing its own wound. In her grandfather's tool chest, she found what she was looking for, a long, thin piece of flexible wire, coiled like a spring. It was a tool for clearing stove flues, but it would serve. Starting at the top of the seam, she threaded the wire into the crack. It was delicate, nerve-wracking work. She had to push hard enough to break the mineral deposits, but gently enough not to jam the wire or cause the rock to shift and close the seam entirely. She worked by feel, inch by inch, her face pressed to the stone, listening to the scrape and grind of the wire against the calcite. The boy watched, silent, twisting a piece of cloth in his hands. After an hour of patient, focused effort, she felt a subtle shift. The resistance lessened. She pulled the wire out. The drip faltered, then steadied, and then began to run. A thin but constant trickle, the same flow they had when they first arrived. A collective sigh went through the small family. The next morning, the pot was full. And that afternoon, the boy ran back from the pool, his face split by a grin. 6, he shouted, his voice echoing in the great room. I counted 6. The first sign of the great change was a sound. A deep, resonant drumming that seemed to come from the entire world at once. It wasn't the sharp crack of thunder, but a low, sustained roar that vibrated through the soles of their feet and up into their chests. The dog stood, whining, his ears flat. The boy ran to his mother. They were deep in the rock, but they could feel the storm that had broken over the mountains. For 3 days, the sound continued, and the water seam, their delicate lifeline, transformed. The trickle became a steady, solid ribbon of clear, cold water. It overflowed the pot, ran down the wall, and filled the channel, sheeting across the floor to the pool. The pool, which had shrunk during the dry season, filled to its brim and then began to creep beyond its old boundaries. The overflow spread into a low-lying area at the far end of the chamber, creating a shallow, marshy wetland where only dust had been before. The mountain was giving them its bounty. The crisis of scarcity was over, replaced by an unforeseen abundance. In the newly damp soil of the marsh, something began to grow. First, there were small white bumps, which over a few days grew into strange, beautiful fungi. They were shaped like tiered bells, pearlescent and faintly luminous in the dim light. The widow, wary, forbade the boy from touching them. But her mother, who had carried the knowledge of her own grandmother with her, knelt and examined them closely. She smelled them, touched one to her tongue, and finally, broke off a small piece and ate it. She closed her eyes, waiting. A slow smile spread across her face. Ghost caps, the boy breathed, giving them a name on the spot. They were not only edible, they were delicious, with a nutty, earthy flavor. A new food source, delivered by the rain. More wonders revealed themselves. A patch of wall near the marsh, always damp, began to glow with a soft, greenish light. It was a colony of phosphorescent moss, awakened by the sudden humidity. It pulsed with a gentle, living light, enough to see by during the night, a soft night light against the absolute dark. The stone room was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a garden. The boy, who had been the sober accountant of their scarcity, was now the delighted chronicler of their abundance. He adopted the names he gave things as their true and only names. The pool was the deep well. The glowing moss was cold fire. The main cavern, the great stone room. The adults found themselves using the names without thinking. The words belonged to the place. When the widow went to the seam for water, she was going to the seam. When she looked at the fish, they were stone swimmers. Through the boy's simple act of naming, they were binding themselves to the place, writing their own story onto its stone walls. It was no longer their grandfather's refuge. It had become their home. The boy's need to measure and record the world found a new expression. On a large, smooth expanse of wall near the sleeping platforms, he began to keep their time. Using a sharp piece of flint, he carved a single, straight notch. It marked the first full moon he had witnessed through the high fissure, a silver disk glimpsed for a few hours. A month later, he carved another beside it. It was their calendar, a private accounting against the indifferent turning of the world outside. Soon he added images, a simple, elegant carving of a stone swimmer, a cluster of circles for the ghost caps, a four-legged shape with a tail that was unmistakably the dog. It was the story of their life, carved in stone. As the deep cold of winter set in, the stone itself became their enemy. It was a vast repository of cold, and the small fires they built in the hearth seemed to beat back the chill for only a few feet. They slept huddled together under all their blankets, the dog a warm, living weight at their feet. The cold was a damp, penetrating thing that settled in their bones. The widow planned to build a larger fire, to burn through their wood supply more quickly. It was her mother who noticed the dog. The shepherd, Wolf, would never sleep just anywhere. He would circle and sniff and finally curl up tightly against one specific part of the wall behind the hearth, even when no fire was lit. He pressed his body right against the stone as if drawing something from it. "He knows where the warmth is," the mother said, watching the animal. Curious, the widow ran her hand over the stones where the dog slept. They were no warmer than the rest. But when she tapped them with her knuckles, the sound was different. Not the solid thud of the rest of the wall, but a hollow, resonant boom. Using the fine edge of a chisel, she carefully worked at the mortar between the stones. It came away easily, as if it were meant to. She pried one of the stones loose and peered into the darkness behind it. She saw not solid rock, but a channel, a square-cut passage that went up and then turned sideways, disappearing into the wall. It was a flue. But it did not go straight up. Her grandfather, in his patient genius, had not just built a chimney to vent smoke. He had built an engine to capture heat. The flue snaked back and forth behind the living area and under the stone sleeping platforms before it found its final exit high up on the mountain face. He had designed the house to warm itself. That evening, the widow built a small, hot fire of dry juniper in the hearth. For an hour, nothing changed. Then, slowly, a miracle began. A gentle, pervasive warmth began to radiate from the stone of the sleeping platform. It was not a hot, direct heat, but a deep, abiding warmth that seemed to come from the heart of the rock itself. She lay her hand on the stone where they slept. It was as warm as a living thing. That night, they slept on the heated stone, the blankets loose over them. The boy sighed in his sleep, his face untroubled. The mother's breathing was deep and even. The widow lay awake for a long time, not from cold or fear, but from a profound and overwhelming sense of being cared for. A man she barely remembered had thought of her, of them, on a cold night like this, decades ago. He had carved this warmth into the stone for them, and the warmth had waited. A full year passed. The boy's wall of notches marked 12 turnings of the moon. Their life in the great stone room was no longer a matter of survival, it was a life of quiet, established grace. The rhythms were known. The water from the seam was constant. The fish in the deep well were plentiful. The ghost caps fruited in the marsh. The cold fire pulsed its gentle light in the dark. The day gold from the tin panels painted the floor in its predictable, beautiful arc. The world outside the fissure had become a rumor, a story they no longer told. One afternoon, the widow stood watching the life of the room. The shaft of day gold was thick with dancing dust motes, a solid pillar of light. In it, her son was carefully placing a small, flat, grey stone onto a larger rock. He was building a map of the deep well, with a unique pebble for each of the stone swimmers he could identify. It was a census, a genealogy. Her mother sat on the bench, a bowl of beans in her lap, sorting them with a slow, peaceful deliberation, her face softened by the reflected golden light. The dog, Wolf, lay stretched out in the warmest part of the light, his paws twitching as he chased something in a dream. The widow felt a stillness settle over her that was as deep and profound as the stone itself. She thought of the town, of the hard faces, of the man who had taken their home. It all felt like it had happened to someone else, in another life. The hardship that had driven them here had been the force that broke open the seed of this new life. It was not a prison. It was the whole world. Her mother looked up from the beans, her eyes meeting her daughter's across the quiet space. She seemed to feel the thought, to see the long journey that had finally come to rest in her daughter's face. He knew, the mother said, her voice not much more than a breath. Your grandfather. The widow looked at the smooth carved table, at the warm sleeping platform, at the tools resting in their niches, their handles dark with the oil of a hand long since turned to dust. A love so fierce and patient it had outlasted death. Yes, the widow said. A long, comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the steady trickle of the water seam. The boy looked up from his stone map, his expression serious, as if delivering a final report. We're all right, he said. It was not a question or a hope, but a simple statement of fact. He had measured the world, and this was his conclusion. The widow looked from his earnest face to her mother's quiet smile. A true smile, the first in over a year, touched her own lips. It felt like a spring thawing. Yes, she said again, her voice clear and sure in the golden air. We'll be all right. The light held them. The sound of the water was a steady pulse. The silence was not empty, but full. They were home.